Welcome to Smart Talk. I'm Scott LaMar, broadcasting from my home studio. It's Veterans Day, and today's program features military topics. But up front, the Battle of Gettysburg was fought more than 150 years ago, yet it still offers enduring lessons in military strategy, decision-making, and leadership. Military strategists and educators have studied the battle for the lessons learned by dissecting the complex and under-duress decisions of the leaders in 1863 and how they can be applied today. Joining us is retired Army Colonel Jeffrey McCausland, co-author of the book Battletested Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for the 21st Century Leaders. He's also a visiting professor of international security at Dickinson College, the founder and CEO of Diamond Six Leadership and Strategy, and former dean of the U.S. Army War College. Colonel McCausland, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Scott, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
If you have a question or a comment, give us a call, 1-800-729-7532. Send an email to smarttalk@witf.org. On Twitter, we are at SmartTalkWITF. Again, that phone number, 1-800-729-7532. Colonel McCausland, I'm going to start by asking the basic question before we get into the book and Gettysburg. Your definition of leadership.
Yeah, my definition of leadership is the one that Tom Bosser, my co-author, who is a distinguished Gettysburg historian and a military veteran like myself, we discussed that at length, and we determined at the onset we wanted to use one provided by a person we think to be a distinguished leader, that being Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower once said, leadership is the ability to decide what has to be done and then get people to want to do it. And we agreed that there were three reasons why we found that definition appropriate. First, obviously, coming from a great leader, the commander-in-chief of the invasion of Normandy and the U.S. effort in Europe, of course, of all Allied forces. President of the United States for 2 terms. Historians, I think, treat Eisenhower's presidency a lot better now than they perhaps did when he left office. And thirdly, a lot of people don't realize this, Eisenhower was an educator himself. He was the president of Columbia University from the time he leaves the Army until he becomes president. Second of all, we find that definition succinct. You could get longer definitions of leadership, but that's pretty short. Decide what has to be done and get others to want to do it. And then last but not least, the second half of that definition always intrigued me because you might think if you'd been president of the United States or a 5-star general or a president of a major university, that all you got to do is give orders and everybody jumps up and moves out with great alacrity. But what he's wisely telling leaders of whatever stripe is you have to try to get a certain amount of buy-in from the team that you are leading, large or small, if you're going to get maximum performance. Yes, they will respect your position and perhaps do what you tell them, but they will only give it their all if they buy into the direction you define.
And so what Eisenhower was saying and what you're ascribing to is that leadership is more than just being the boss or being the manager or being the superior, that it is to get people to buy in to what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish.
Exactly right. And it's also, I think, 2 other things are very important. And that is, one is if you took that definition at face value, you might say, well, gee whiz, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot were great leaders. Did they decide what had to be done? I guess they did. Did they get people excited about doing it? Sadly, in many cases, they did. But the other building block of that, of course, is ethics and integrity and character. And I think if Eisenhower was on the call this morning, he would totally agree with that, but say that's absolutely implicit in an American Western democracy definition of leadership. The character and integrity is fundamental. And then secondly, the leader has to create a climate whereby he can be led or she can be led, and others have the willingness and feel empowered to lead, particularly at opportunities for the organization. In the Battle of Gettysburg, there are numerous examples where the initiative on part of leaders at lower level, making very important decisions, made all the difference between defeat and victory for the Union Army.
And we're going to talk about that in a moment. The book, Battle-Tested Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for 21st Century Leaders. How would you describe the book?
Well, I describe the book pretty much as the title suggests, Scott. My colleague, Tom Bosser, and I, as part of this company I run, Diamond Six Leadership, had done numerous leadership seminars on the battlefield. Way back when I was the dean of the War College, we would take War College students down to the park, of course. And in fact, historically, one of the reasons the park was created was to offer a place for officers to have a so-called military staff ride. But Tom and I decided that, if we focus on leadership principles and the basic history of the battle, this serves as an enormous classroom for any leader. And we've done that with corporate leaders from all across the United States, and then decided that we were going to take this and transform it into a book, try to get a wider reach. But in essence, use this battle as a case study to talk about leadership concepts that we think are enduring, whether you were leading the Hebrews out of Egypt or you're leading a corporation today or a military unit at Gettysburg. There are certain concepts and principles that are totally enduring. And finally, of course, it's my fixed belief that if a bunch of people of good intellect had the access to any organization for a few days, they could speak very candidly about how well or how poorly that organization was run. But if they visited the organization when it was undergoing a crisis, good leadership and bad leadership would stick out in bolder relief, because crisis, if you will, compresses time. And in essence, two armies such as the ones that met at Gettysburg are organizations in crisis. So therefore, those concepts of leadership, poorly executed or well executed, stick out in much more bold relief because of the urgency of the moment, and therefore I think make it a much more instructive period of time. And then last but not least, from an educational standpoint, I firmly believe that people learn, particularly talking about leadership, learn from the power of stories. And the power of stories and thinking about people not unlike them who did heroic things under enormous pressure makes it more instructive, gives it what I call a stickiness that sticks with people after they've departed that big classroom down at Gettysburg.
The Battle of Gettysburg was fought in July 1863, 157 years ago. Are there people you've come across, maybe who, when they first, became part of Diamond Six as for leadership lessons, that thought there's not anything we can learn from something that occurred 157 years ago? Are there people that have that thinking?
It's funny you should say that, Scott, because that was my first concern when I started doing this. And I found that was very, very uncommon. But it has happened in a few cases. And these are people who believe that you can segment leadership into there's, leadership for corporate organizations. There's leadership for government service. There's leadership for religious organizations. There's leadership for the military. And all these things are separated into nice little boxes and separation points. But in every case, when I've had people bring that up, usually at the very onset of a seminar, I don't find that enduring. And by the end of the day, I find that they get into it and fully embrace the notion, as I said, that there are certain concepts and principles of leadership that are, in fact, enduring. And I think what's interesting about Gettysburg, if you think about it, almost back to the day when it was fought and thereafter, there seem to be those who predicted that. I often quote Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, who, of course, was the commander of the 20th Maine. And that particular regiment will do distinguished things during the battle on the second day that ensure that the Union Army is, in fact, successful. Without them, they might have well failed. He comes back to the battlefield in 1889 to dedicate a monument, which is still present on the battlefield to this very day. And he gives a speech. And the last sentence of that speech, oftentimes I read, he says, generations that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and to dream. And it seemed to me that what Chamberlain is suggesting, just what we're trying to do, that people will use this particular historical event to learn things that they can apply in their own lives.
You're listening to Smart Talk on WITF, your home for NPR News and all things regional. I'm Scott LaMar.